In 1860, Britain's leading art critic published an essay on economics that got him banned from the magazine printing it, denounced in Parliament and dismissed by colleagues as clinically insane. John Ruskin had committed an unforgivable act. He suggested that getting rich might not be virtuous, that the price tag on an object told you nothing about its actual value, and that an economy making some people wealthy while degrading most people into machine parts was not successful, but catastrophically broken. The fury his essay provoked tells you something important. He had touched a nerve, exposed a lie that Victorian society needed to believe in order to sleep at night. Ruskin walked through the richest empire in human history and saw poverty everywhere. Not just material poverty, but poverty of spirit, of beauty, of meaningful work. He looked at mass-produced goods and could read in their perfect uniformity the deadening of the workers who made them. He watched cities blacken under coal smoke and understood he was witnessing not progress, but a kind of civilizational suicide. The methodical destruction of everything that made life worth living in exchange for increasing quantities of things nobody actually needed. What makes Ruskin dangerous then and now is that he refused to accept the basic premise of modern economics, that value means whatever someone will pay for it, that wealth is whatever accumulates, that how we make things does not matter as long as we make more of them. He insisted instead on asking what prosperity was actually for, what human life required to flourish, whether societies were becoming richer or poorer in ways that conventional measures could not see. These questions got him dismissed as a crank in his own time. They remain almost impossible to ask seriously in ours. But here is what makes him impossible to dismiss. He was right about things that took a century to prove. The pollution he described as a storm cloud darkening England was real atmospheric change from industrial emissions. The worker degradation he diagnosed has been confirmed by decades of research on alienation and occupational psychology. The ugliness he saw in mass production turned out to signal ecological damage that conventional economics treated as irrelevant externality. His aesthetic judgments, dismissed as mere personal taste, tracked objective harms that took generations to measure and are now destroying the conditions for human survival. Ruskin began as an art critic, defending a painter others thought was mad. He ended as a social prophet, warning of catastrophes nobody wanted to hear about. In between, he developed a comprehensive philosophy connecting how we see to how we live, what we make to who we become, beauty to justice, economics to ecology. He argued that these domains were not separate but aspects of a single question: what kind of world do we want to live in, and what are we willing to sacrifice to get it? He was also an authoritarian who opposed democracy, a misogynist who wanted women confined to domestic life, a paternalist who thought workers needed guidance from their betters, and quite possibly insane for much of his later life. His solutions to the problems he identified were often worse than the problems. His attempts to build alternative communities failed comprehensively. His politics were reactionary, his economics impractical, his social experiments disasters. Yet his influence spread across the world, inspiring Gandhi's resistance to British imperialism, shaping the British Labour Party, feeding into modernist literature and architecture, founding environmental conservation movements. People took from him what they needed and discarded what they did not, transforming his feudal fantasies into democratic movements, his aesthetic elitism into arguments for universal access to beauty, his nostalgic anti-capitalism into practical programs for worker dignity and environmental protection. This makes Ruskin one of the most important and most problematic thinkers of the modern age, someone we desperately need and cannot simply accept, whose insights remain vital even as his prescriptions prove toxic. The crises we face now, climate catastrophe, meaningless work, social fracture, aesthetic degradation, are precisely the crises he diagnosed a century and a half ago. Whether his way of seeing them can help us address them, whether we can preserve his insights while rejecting his politics, whether his questions can lead to answers he never imagined, these are urgent matters, not historical curiosities. This is not a story about a Victorian sage dispensing timeless wisdom. It is an account of a brilliant, damaged man who saw clearly in some directions and was completely blind in others, whose life's work was simultaneously prophetic and deluded, whose failures are as instructive as his successes. Understanding Ruskin means understanding how insight and blindness can coexist, how someone can be catastrophically wrong about solutions while being devastatingly right about problems, how ideas can prove useful even when their original context was irredeemably flawed. The Victorian age believed it was marching toward inevitable progress, that industrial capitalism was lifting humanity to unprecedented heights of wealth and civilization. Ruskin stood in the middle of that march and said, "Look at what you are actually doing. Look at the blackened rivers and degraded workers and ugliness spreading everywhere. And tell me this is progress." They called him mad and kept marching. We are living in the world that March created, and the questions he asked have not gone away. They have only become more urgent as the consequences he warned about accelerate toward catastrophe. This video excavates Ruskin's ideas not to celebrate or condemn him, but to understand what he saw and why it mattered, where he was right and where catastrophically wrong, what his insights can still teach us and what his failures warn us against. It is an attempt to take seriously both his vision and his blindness, to inherit his questions without inheriting his answers, to learn from his example without repeating his errors. Because the alternative, dismissing him as irrelevant Victorian eccentric or embracing him uncritically as prophet, both miss what makes him essential, his insistence that we cannot separate how we see from how we live, what we make from who we become, beauty from justice, prosperity from human flourishing. That insistence, stripped of his feudal fantasies and reconstructed for democratic purposes, may be exactly what we need to address crises he foresaw but could not have imagined in their current scale and urgency. Part 1. The Theology of Seeing. Ruskin's entire philosophical architecture rests on a single revolutionary premise: that perception is a moral act. This was not the gentle observation of a Sunday painter, but a radical challenge to how his society understood knowledge, beauty, and truth. For Ruskin, to see properly meant to see honestly, completely, and with reverence, and most people, he argued, lived in a state of willful blindness. His magnum opus, Modern Painters, begun when he was only 23, was ostensibly a defense of the painter J.M.W. Turner, against critics who dismissed Turner's landscapes as confused and inaccurate. But Ruskin's defense transformed into something much larger, a complete theory of perception and truth in art. His argument was deceptively simple, but devastating in its implications. Turner's paintings were not less accurate than the detailed, polished works of earlier masters. They were more accurate because they captured how nature actually appears to an eye that truly looks. This concept, which Ruskin called truth to nature, was not about photographic realism. It was about fidelity to the actual experience of seeing, not to conventions about what seeing should look like. When Turner painted a stormy sky as a chaos of colour and light, he was being more truthful than painters who rendered storms according to established formulas, even if those formulas were technically masterful. Ruskin wrote, "The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way." Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion, all in one. This was not aesthetic theory, it was theology. Ruskin believed that nature was the direct handiwork of God, and that every rock, cloud, and leaf contained divine intention. Therefore, to misrepresent nature in art was not merely bad technique, it was a form of blasphemy, a lie told about the divine order. To paint a conventional tree rather than studying how trees actually grow was to prefer human vanity over divine truth. But here is where Ruskin's theory becomes genuinely interesting and moves beyond simple religious moralizing. He argued that this honest seeing required moral qualities in the observer, patience, humility, freedom from selfish desire. You cannot see a mountain truly if you are calculating how to profit from it, if you are anxious about your social standing, or if you're simply rushing past it without attention. Perception for Ruskin demanded a kind of self-emptying, what Zen Buddhists would call beginner's mind, though Ruskin would never have used that language. This idea had immediate practical consequences for how Ruskin evaluated art. He dismissed entire schools of painting not because they lacked technical skill, but because they displayed moral failures of attention. The classical landscape tradition, for instance, which arranged nature into pleasing compositions following established rules, was, in his view, fundamentally dishonest. It put human aesthetic preference above the actual structure of the world, which meant it was both bad art and bad ethics. Consider his analysis of water, a subject Ruskin returned to obsessively. He spent years studying how water actually moves, reflects light, creates patterns, not through casual observation, but through the kind of devoted attention most people reserve for sacred texts. He could describe in forensic detail the difference between the water of a mountain stream and a lowland river, between water flowing over granite and water flowing over limestone. And he could instantly recognize when a painter had painted water from formula rather than observation. The scholarly debate around Ruskin's theory of perception divides into several camps. Some art historians, particularly those influenced by formalist criticism in the mid-20th century, dismissed his approach as hopelessly entangled with Victorian moralizing and religious sentiment. They argued that art should be evaluated on purely aesthetic grounds, that bringing ethics into aesthetic judgment was a category error. Others, particularly more recent critics interested in ecological thinking and phenomenology, the philosophical study of consciousness and experience, have found in Ruskin a prescient understanding of how attention shapes reality. The philosopher Roger Scruton defended a version of Ruskin's position, arguing that aesthetic experience does have a moral dimension because it trains us in certain modes of attention that carry over into ethical life. If you learn to see a tree patiently and completely, you develop capacities for attention that make you less likely to view that tree or a person purely as an instrument for your purposes. Conversely, critics like Terry Eagleton have argued that Ruskin's moralization of aesthetics was itself a symptom of Victorian class anxiety, a way for the privileged to feel spiritually superior while doing nothing about actual material conditions. Where does Ruskin's theory fail or prove inadequate? First, his insistence on truth to nature struggles with abstract art that does not attempt to represent the visible world at all. A Mondrian painting or a Rothko colour field cannot be evaluated by fidelity to natural appearance because that is not their project. Ruskin, writing in the 19th century, could not have anticipated this development, but it exposes a limitation in his framework. Second, his theological grounding for aesthetic judgment becomes problematic in a secular or pluralistic context. If you do not share Ruskin's belief that nature is divine handiwork, his claim that misrepresenting nature is morally wrong loses much of its force. You might still value accurate observation, but not for the reasons Ruskin gives. This is not necessarily a fatal problem. Some of his insights can be detached from their theological roots, but it does mean we cannot simply adopt his system wholesale. Third, and perhaps most seriously, Ruskin's emphasis on individual moral perception can obscure structural and social dimensions of art production. He tended to locate artistic failure in the personal moral failings of individual artists rather than in the economic or social systems that shaped what and how they painted. A Marxist critic would point out that what Ruskin called moral failures of attention might actually be effects of market pressures, patron demands, or class position. The painter who works quickly according to formula might not lack moral seriousness, but might simply need to eat. Yet, despite these limitations, Ruskin's core insight remains powerful, and I would argue empirically verifiable. The quality of attention we bring to the world does shape what we can perceive, and this has ethical implications. A society that trains people to see only instrumentally, to view everything as potential resource or commodity, will produce different art, different relationships, and different political possibilities than a society that cultivates patient, devoted attention. Whether or not you accept Ruskin's theology, this observation about the connection between perception and ethics remains deeply challenging. Ruskin applied this theory of seeing not just to landscape painting, but to architecture, and it is here that his ideas proved most influential and most controversial. He argued that Gothic architecture, the pointed arches and elaborate ornament of medieval cathedrals, was superior to classical architecture, not because it was prettier, but because it embodied a truer, more honest relationship between maker and material. Gothic builders, he claimed, allowed stone to express its own nature. They worked with its grain and texture rather than forcing it into rigid, predetermined forms. Moreover, and this is crucial, Gothic architecture preserved space for individual creativity and imperfection. Each carved leaf or figure was slightly different because it was made by a human hand, not stamped from a mould. This brings us to what would become the central political dimension of Ruskin's thought, his claim that beauty and justice were inseparable, that you could not have beautiful architecture in a society built on ugly labour. The Gothic cathedral was beautiful not despite, but because of its irregularities, because those irregularities were evidence of human freedom and creativity in the making. Industrial production, by contrast, demanded perfect uniformity, which meant it demanded the death of individual expression in the worker. Here, Ruskin was making an empirical claim that can be tested, that certain modes of production are incompatible with certain aesthetic outcomes, and that these aesthetic outcomes matter because they reflect and shape human flourishing. A factory-made object, no matter how technically perfect, will lack what he called the life that comes from direct human engagement with material. And, more importantly, the making of that perfect object has required turning the worker into a machine, crushing exactly those human capacities, attention, creativity, judgment, that Ruskin believed art should cultivate. We can see Ruskin's influence here flowing directly into the arts and crafts movement of William Morris and the philosophy of craftwork that continues to animate maker culture today. But we can also see why his ideas infuriated classical economists and remain controversial. He was essentially arguing that efficiency, uniformity and mass production, the very things that made industrial capitalism so productive, were aesthetic and moral evils, that the abundance they created came at an unacceptable cost in human degradation. Is he right? This remains one of the most important and unresolved questions his work poses. Can meaningful human work exist at industrial scale, or does scale itself necessitate the kind of division and routinization that Ruskin found dehumanizing? The contemporary debates about automation, artificial intelligence and the future of work are in many ways still wrestling with the question Ruskin posed, whether there are forms of making and working that are essential to human flourishing and that cannot be replaced without profound loss, regardless of gains in productivity or wealth. Part 2. The Filth of Wealth. In 1860, at the height of his fame as an art critic, Ruskin committed professional suicide. He began publishing a series of essays on political economy that would be collected as Unto This Last, a work so controversial that the editor stopped the series early due to reader outrage. What had Ruskin done to provoke such fury? He had committed the unforgivable sin of the Victorian era. He suggested that perhaps getting rich was not actually virtuous, and that the science of economics as practiced was not science at all, but sophisticated moral evasion. Ruskin's economic philosophy begins with a deliberately provocative move. He insists on taking words seriously, on asking what we actually mean when we use terms like wealth, value, price and profit. This sounds simple, even naive, but it allowed him to expose what he saw as the foundational fraud of classical political economy. The economists of his day, figures like Adam Smith, David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, claimed to study wealth scientifically, objectively, as if it were a natural phenomenon like gravity or magnetism. Ruskin argued this was intellectual theatre, a way of disguising moral and political choices as neutral facts. His central challenge was elegant and devastating. He asked, what is wealth actually for? The classical economists defined wealth as anything people desired and were willing to pay for, anything that had exchange value in the market. But Ruskin pointed out this made the definition circular and morally empty. If wealth is whatever people want, and people want opium, pornography, weapons, then these things are wealth. If a society grows rich by producing things that harm human life and flourishing, is it actually becoming wealthier? Ruskin proposed instead what he called vital wealth, wealth that actually supports and enhances life. He wrote, "There is no wealth but life." Life, including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. That country is the richest which nourishes the greatest number of noble and happy human beings. This was not sentimental hand-waving. It was a demand that economics recognize its actual subject matter, not abstract exchange values, but human well-being. The implications were immediate and radical. If the purpose of economic activity is to support human flourishing, then many things counted as wealth by classical economics are actually forms of poverty. A factory that produces cheap goods but destroys the health and creativity of its workers is not creating wealth. It is destroying it. A financial system that generates paper profits while leaving real people hungry or homeless is not working properly, regardless of what the numbers say. Pollution, degraded labour, ugliness, these are not unfortunate side effects of wealth creation, they are forms of wealth destruction that conventional economics simply fails to measure. Ruskin's critique of exchange value cuts even deeper. Classical economics treated labour as a commodity like any other, something that could be bought at the lowest possible price without moral concern. The market would determine the wage, and that wage was by definition correct because it reflected supply and demand. Ruskin found this obscene. He argued that labour was not a commodity because the labourer was not a thing but a person, and persons have needs that exist independent of market prices. He offered a thought experiment that still troubles economists today. Imagine two societies, both producing the same total quantity of goods. In the first society, the work is distributed relatively equally, people work reasonable hours at varied tasks and have time for family, creativity and rest. In the second society, a small number work themselves into early graves while others remain idle. The work is monotonous and degrading, and people spend their non-working hours too exhausted for anything but passive consumption. Classical economics sees these societies as equivalent. They have the same gross domestic product. Ruskin argued they are radically different in actual wealth, in life, and that an economic science that cannot see this difference is not merely incomplete, but actively harmful. His attack on the concept of economic man, the rational self-interested actor at the heart of classical theory, was similarly fundamental. Economists claimed people acted to maximize their individual utility, their personal satisfaction or profit. Ruskin pointed out this was empirically false. Soldiers die for their country, parents sacrifice for children, friends help friends at cost to themselves. These are not exceptions or irrational aberrations, they are central features of human life. An economics that treats them as anomalies and builds its entire theory around a fictional creature who exists only in textbooks is not describing reality. It is prescribing a particular kind of person and society. Moreover, Ruskin argued, and this is crucial, acting as if people are purely self-interested actually makes them more self-interested. If you design institutions based on the assumption that everyone is selfish, you create incentives for selfishness and punishments for generosity. You educate people to believe that virtue is foolishness and exploitation is wisdom. The economic theory does not describe pre-existing human nature. It actively produces a particular kind of human nature. This insight that economic models are performative, that they create the reality they claim to describe, has been rediscovered by contemporary behavioral economists and economic sociologists, though often without acknowledging Ruskin's priority. Ruskin proposed an alternative foundation for economics, the idea of just price and just wage. This sounds medieval, and indeed Ruskin was consciously reaching back to pre-capitalist economic thought. But his version was not simply traditional. It was based on his principle that economic transactions are first and foremost relationships between persons, not exchanges between abstractions. A just price is one that allows the seller to live well while treating the buyer fairly. A just wage is one that recognizes the full humanity of the worker and allows them to flourish, not merely to survive. Classical economists howled at this. How do you determine just price without markets? Is not justice itself subjective? Who decides what constitutes flourishing? Ruskin's answer was that these are precisely the questions a real economic science should address, not evade through mathematical formalism. That they are difficult does not make them optional. Every society already makes judgments about justice and human needs, market societies included. The question is whether we make these judgments explicitly through democratic deliberation and moral reasoning, or implicitly by allowing market power to decide while pretending the decision was made by natural law. The scholarly reception of Ruskin's economics has been extraordinarily polarized. Mainstream economists from his day to ours have generally dismissed him as an eccentric moralist who understood nothing about how economies actually function. They point out that his analysis lacks mathematical rigor, that his concept of vital wealth is vague and unmeasurable, that his just price theory provides no workable mechanism for actually setting prices. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith, generally sympathetic to heterodox economic thought, wrote that Ruskin's economic writings were a combination of penetrating insight and complete nonsense, and the reader is never quite sure which is which. But others have found in Ruskin a prophetic anticipation of contemporary critiques of neoclassical economics. The economist E. F. Schumacher, author of Small is Beautiful, acknowledged Ruskin as a primary influence on his work developing Buddhist economics and appropriate technology. Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate in economics, has praised Ruskin's insistence that economics must concern itself with human capabilities and flourishing, not just preference satisfaction, though Sen does not follow Ruskin's specific prescriptions. Ecological economists have embraced Ruskin's recognition that conventional economic measures ignore environmental destruction and resource depletion. The most sophisticated defense of Ruskin's economics comes not from economists, but from political philosophers and social theorists. Michael Sandel's critique of market reasoning and commodification echoes Ruskin's argument that some things should not be for sale because selling them corrupts their nature and our relationship to them. Elizabeth Anderson's work on the different spheres of value and the ways markets crowd out other forms of valuation develops insights Ruskin articulated a century and a half earlier. Ruskin understood what these contemporary thinkers are trying to recover, that economics is inescapably normative, inescapably about values and human purposes, and that pretending otherwise does not make it objective, but simply hides whose values are being served. Where does Ruskin's economic philosophy fail most clearly? First, he never developed a workable institutional mechanism for implementing his ideas. Saying wages should be just does not tell us how to determine just wages in practice, especially in complex modern economies with thousands of different occupations. Ruskin's own attempts at economic experiment, which we will discuss later, were small-scale and largely unsuccessful. His critique of capitalism was often more convincing than his alternative. Second, his economics assumes a level of social consensus about human goods and flourishing that may not exist in pluralistic societies. What counts as a good life differs across cultures, religions, and individual temperaments. Market systems, whatever their other flaws, at least allow people to pursue their own diverse conceptions of the good without requiring agreement. Ruskin's more prescriptive approach risks becoming paternalistic or authoritarian. Third, Ruskin underestimated the genuine productivity gains and human benefits of industrial capitalism. His focus on what was lost, craft skill, worker autonomy, aesthetic quality, sometimes blinded him to what was gained: increased abundance, reduced scarcity, new possibilities for human development. A medieval peasant might have done more varied work than a factory labourer, but they also faced starvation, disease, and early death at rates that would horrify Ruskin. The question is not whether to return to pre-industrial conditions, which is impossible and undesirable, but how to preserve what was valuable in older modes of work within or alongside modern productive capacity. Fourth, and perhaps most problematic, Ruskin's economics rested on deeply conservative and even reactionary social assumptions. His ideal economic order was explicitly hierarchical, with a benevolent aristocracy guiding and caring for workers who knew their place. He opposed democracy in economic life, believing workers should trust their betters rather than organize for their own interests. This is not an accidental feature that can be separated from his core insights. It is bound up with his whole vision of social order. Modern readers, attracted to Ruskin's critique of capitalism, often have to perform contortions to extract the insights they value while discarding his authoritarian politics. Yet, despite these profound limitations, Ruskin identified real pathologies in how we think about economic life. His insistence that growth in gross domestic product is not the same as improvement in human well-being is now widely accepted, at least in theory, though we still struggle to implement it in practice. His recognition that environmental destruction and social degradation represent real costs that market prices fail to capture has become the foundation of environmental economics. His argument that some things should not be commodified, that not everything should be for sale, finds expression in contemporary debates about markets in organs, reproductive services, or education. Most importantly, perhaps, Ruskin insisted that economics is too important to be left to economists operating as if they were studying physics. Economic arrangements shape what kinds of lives are possible, what kinds of persons we become, what kinds of relationships we can form. These are political and moral questions, not technical ones, and they require public deliberation and democratic decision, not just expert management. Whether or not we accept his specific answers, Ruskin's demand that we ask the questions remains vital. His most quoted economic statement, "There is no wealth but life," sounds like a platitude until you think through its implications. If he is right, then vast swaths of what we call economic activity are actually forms of organized destruction. The question is whether we have the courage to follow that thought where it leads. Part 3. The Nature of Gothic. In 1853, Ruskin published what would become his most politically influential work, a single chapter from The Stones of Venice, titled The Nature of Gothic. This essay would be read by William Morris as a revelation, reprinted by socialist societies and distributed to workers as a call to resistance. What made a chapter about medieval architecture into a revolutionary manifesto? Ruskin's argument begins with a detailed formal analysis of Gothic architecture, the pointed arches, the flying buttresses, the elaborate carved ornament. But he quickly pivots to a startling claim. The formal characteristics of Gothic are not arbitrary stylistic choices, but necessary expressions of a particular relationship between worker and work. Gothic looks the way it does because it was made by free human beings, exercising creativity and judgment. You can read the social relations of production directly in the aesthetic qualities of the object. Consider the carved ornament on a Gothic cathedral, the hundreds of unique figures, leaves and grotesques covering every surface. No two are exactly alike. Some are masterful, others crude, many fall somewhere between. Classical architects and their Victorian imitators saw this irregularity as a defect, evidence of inferior craftsmanship. Ruskin saw it as the essential glory of Gothic, proof that individual masons had been allowed to create, to experiment, to express themselves. The roughness and imperfection were not failures, but achievements, evidence of human freedom in the making. He contrasted this with classical architecture and its Victorian revivals, where every column had to be exactly like every other column, every ornament precisely repeated according to pattern. This perfection could only be achieved, Ruskin argued, by reducing the workers to machines, by demanding they execute without thinking, repeat without varying. The perfect uniformity was purchased at the price of human degradation. You could have beautiful things made by degraded labour or less perfect things made by free labour, but you could not have both. This is where Ruskin made his most radical move. He argued we should prefer the imperfect work of free hands to the perfect work of enslaved ones. He wrote, "You must either make a tool of the creature or a man of him. You cannot make both." Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools, to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels and their arms strike curves like compasses, you must unhumanize them. The implications extended far beyond architecture. Ruskin was articulating a general theory about the relationship between production methods and human flourishing. Any system that demands perfect uniformity in output must crush human variation in input. Industrial capitalism, with its division of labour and machine production, necessarily degrades workers because it requires them to become appendages to machines, performing the same operation endlessly without thought or creativity. He described the division of labour, celebrated by Adam Smith as the source of productivity gains, as division of human beings. Smith's famous pin factory, where each worker performed one small operation in making a pin, and therefore pins could be produced much faster, looked to Ruskin like a chamber of horrors. The worker, who spent 12 hours a day pointing the ends of pins, was being systematically stupefied, their full human capacities allowed to atrophy. Yes, more pins were produced, but at what cost? A society rich in pins but poor in fully developed human beings was not actually richer, it was catastrophically poorer. Ruskin's alternative vision centred on what he called the right and noble labour, work that engaged the whole person, mind and hand together, that allowed for judgment and creativity, that produced variety rather than uniformity. This was not romantic primitivism, a call to return to prehistoric conditions. It was a demand that work be organised in ways compatible with human nature and human dignity. He acknowledged this would mean accepting roughness, irregularity and lower output, but argued these were acceptable prices for human freedom. The influence of this essay on the arts and crafts movement cannot be overstated. William Morris read The Nature of Gothic in 1858 and later said it seemed to point out a new road on which the world should travel. Morris spent the rest of his life trying to create that road, founding workshops that produced handmade furniture, textiles and books according to medieval guild principles. The arts and crafts movement spread throughout Britain and America, inspiring craft communities, design reform movements, and eventually feeding into early 20th century modernism. But the movement also revealed the deep tensions and contradictions in Ruskin's vision. Morris's beautiful handcrafted goods were extraordinarily expensive, affordable only by the wealthy clients Morris increasingly despised. The attempt to revive craft production in a capitalist economy meant that craft objects became luxury items for elite consumption. The workers Morris employed were better treated than factory workers, but they still worked for wages and their products still entered the market. Morris himself recognized the problem, becoming increasingly radical politically and eventually embracing revolutionary socialism. But he never solved the practical problem of how to make beautiful craft objects available to ordinary people at scale. This exposes the central weakness in Ruskin's analysis of work. He was largely correct that industrial division of labour degrades workers and that craft production can be more fulfilling. But he had no workable answer to the problem of scale and abundance. Hand production is slower and more expensive, which means either accepting less total output or restricting access to the wealthy. For most of human history, beautiful objects were rare luxuries precisely because they required skilled labour and extensive time to produce. Industrial production, whatever its costs in worker degradation and aesthetic quality, did make material abundance possible for billions of people. The question is whether this trade-off is necessary or whether we can imagine production systems that combine the productivity of industrial methods with the dignity and satisfaction of craft work. Contemporary experiments with worker cooperatives, makers' spaces and open-source production are attempts to find this synthesis, though none have yet achieved anything like industrial scale. Ruskin posed the question more clearly than anyone before him, but his answer, essentially a return to medieval guild organisation, is neither possible nor wholly desirable. Modern scholarship on Ruskin's work theory divides sharply. Labour historians and socialist intellectuals have celebrated his recognition of worker degradation and his insistence that how we work shapes who we are. They point out that Ruskin articulated, decades before Marx published Capital, many of the same insights about alienation and the dehumanizing effects of capitalist production. Some have tried to claim Ruskin as a proto-socialist, though this requires ignoring large parts of his actual politics. Feminist scholars have been more critical, pointing out that Ruskin's celebration of craft work was entirely gendered male. He idealized the male artisan, but had nothing to say about the equally skilled work women performed in textile production, cooking, or care work. His vision of noble labour excluded the forms of labour culturally coded as feminine, reinforcing the Victorian ideology that separate spheres for men and women were natural and good. Moreover, his call for workers to accept guidance from their betters rather than organise for their own interests was fundamentally paternalistic. Post-colonial critics have noted that Ruskin's Gothic revival was bound up with British imperial ideology, celebrating a supposedly pure English medieval past, while ignoring or denigrating non-European craft traditions. His aesthetic theory, despite its claims to universal truth, was deeply provincial, treating European artistic conventions as timeless standards. The contemporary relevance of Ruskin's work theory is complex and contested. On one hand, we are living through the very automation crisis he predicted, with artificial intelligence and robotics threatening to eliminate not just manual labour, but increasingly cognitive work as well. His question, what happens to human beings when machines can do everything we can do, remains urgent and largely unanswered. Do we celebrate the liberation from toil, or mourn the loss of meaning and purpose that work, even flawed work, has traditionally provided? On the other hand, the explosion of maker culture, craft brewing, artisan bakeries and small batch production suggests a hunger for exactly the kind of work Ruskin celebrated. These remain niche markets serving mostly affluent consumers, repeating the arts and crafts dilemma. But they indicate that Ruskin identified something real about human needs that purely instrumental labour fails to satisfy. The philosopher Matthew Crawford, in Shop Class's Soulcraft, has revived Ruskin's arguments for a contemporary audience, arguing that manual craft work provides cognitive and ethical benefits that abstract knowledge work cannot. Working with physical materials, Crawford argues, demands attention to reality in ways that manipulating symbols does not. You cannot bullshit a piece of wood. It either fits or it does not. This grounds your thinking in ways that much contemporary white-collar work, lost in layers of abstraction and organizational politics, fails to do. But Crawford also acknowledges what Ruskin did not, that much manual work is not ennobling craft, but simple drudgery, and that preserving space for meaningful work requires political and economic changes Ruskin was unwilling to support. Workers need power, not just sympathetic employers. They need democratic control over production, not guidance from aristocratic patrons. Ruskin's insights about the importance of work for human flourishing remain valuable, but they must be separated from his authoritarian politics. The deepest question Ruskin's work theory poses is whether human flourishing requires productive activity, or whether we could be equally fulfilled in a world where machines do all the work and humans only consume and play. Ruskin clearly thought meaningful work was essential to human dignity and purpose. Many contemporary advocates of universal basic income implicitly reject this, imagining a future where people are freed from work to pursue whatever interests them. Neither position is obviously correct, and which proves true may depend on social choices rather than fixed human nature. We might discover that with the right cultural supports, people can find meaning and purpose without wage labour. Or we might find that Ruskin was right, that humans need to make things, to struggle with material reality, to see the concrete results of their effort in ways that purely symbolic or playful activities cannot provide. The stakes of this question, as automation accelerates, could not be higher. Part 4. The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. In 1884, Ruskin delivered one of the strangest and most prophetic lectures of his career. Titled The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, it described what he claimed was a new kind of weather, a darkness spreading across England unlike anything in previous history. Many who heard the lecture thought Ruskin had gone mad, that his description of plague clouds and diseased wind was the ravings of a disturbed mind. They were half right. Ruskin was struggling with mental illness, but he was also describing something entirely real, the visible environmental destruction caused by industrial pollution. Ruskin had been observing weather obsessively for decades, keeping detailed diaries of cloud formations, wind patterns, and the quality of light. He noticed, starting in the 1850s, that the clouds were changing. There was a new kind of cloud, low, dark and grimy, that brought not the clean rain of natural storms, but a dirty drizzle that left everything coated in grime. The sun was dimmer, the air thicker, the very quality of light different than it had been in his youth. What Ruskin was observing, though he did not have the scientific vocabulary to name it precisely, was air pollution on an unprecedented scale. The burning of coal in thousands of factories and homes was filling the atmosphere with particulates, sulfur compounds, and other pollutants. These were changing weather patterns, reducing visibility, damaging plants and buildings, and harming human health. Ruskin was among the first to connect the dots between industrial production and environmental degradation, to recognize that what industry called progress was also destruction of the natural world. His lecture was not systematic environmental science. It was prophecy in the biblical sense, warning of divine judgment for human wickedness. He described the storm cloud as a manifestation of moral corruption, the physical consequence of a society that valued profit over beauty, efficiency over life. The sky is covered with grey cloud, not rain cloud, but a dry black veil which no ray of sunshine can pierce, he wrote. This was not metaphor, but literal description, and also moral indictment. What makes this lecture so remarkable is how early it was. Ruskin was describing anthropogenic climate change, human-caused alteration of atmospheric conditions, decades before the scientific community began seriously studying such phenomena. He lacked the concepts and measurements to prove what he observed, but his trained eye and lifetime of attention to natural beauty allowed him to detect changes others missed or dismissed. He was right. The Industrial Revolution was fundamentally altering the environment, and the consequences would be catastrophic if unchecked. But Ruskin's environmental thought went much deeper than observation of pollution. Throughout his work, from his earliest writing on art through his later social criticism, he articulated what we would now call an ecological worldview, a recognition that human beings exist within and depend upon natural systems, and that disrupting those systems threatens human well-being. His theory of wealth, that there is no wealth but life, was fundamentally ecological. He understood that real wealth derives from the productivity of living systems, from healthy soil that grows food, clean water that sustains life, forests that provide timber and regulate climate. Financial wealth that came from degrading these natural systems was illusory. It was consuming capital and calling it income. He wrote, The force of the guinea you have in your pocket depends wholly on the default of a guinea in your neighbour's pocket. If he did not want it, it would be of no use to you. But the value of the food in the granary depends wholly on the fact that someone does want it, and will be the better for getting it. This seems simple, but has profound implications. Financial transactions are zero-sum. My gain is your loss. But real wealth, food, shelter, beauty, depends on the productivity of natural and human systems that can grow or shrink. An economy that maximizes financial transactions while degrading the underlying systems that produce real wealth is not becoming richer, but poorer. Though this poverty may not show up in conventional accounting until catastrophe strikes. Ruskin applied this ecological understanding to urban design and planning. He argued that cities should preserve extensive green space, that workers needed access to nature and beauty not just for recreation, but for psychological and spiritual health. The industrial cities of his era, smoke-blackened warrens of factories and slums, were, in his view, not just ugly but pathological, designed to maximize production while destroying the humans who produced. A city that made people sick, that cut them off from natural beauty and healthy air, was not an efficient city, but a sick one, regardless of its industrial output. His influence on the Garden City movement and early urban planning was substantial. Ebenezer Howard, founding the Garden City movement in the late 19th century, explicitly drew on Ruskin's ideas about the need to integrate nature and human habitation. The principle that cities should include parks, gardens and green belts rather than being purely built environment became standard in progressive urban planning, though often honoured more in theory than practice. Ruskin also developed what amounts to an aesthetic ecology, the recognition that beauty in nature serves functions beyond human pleasure. The complex forms of plants and animals, the intricate patterns of landscape, these were not decorative extras, but expressions of ecological relationships. When humans simplified landscapes for industrial efficiency, planting monocultures, straightening rivers, draining wetlands, they were not just making things uglier, they were destroying functional complexity. The ugliness was a symptom of ecological damage, not just an aesthetic problem. This insight has been powerfully confirmed by contemporary ecology. Biodiversity, the variety of living forms in an ecosystem, is not just more beautiful than monoculture. It is more resilient, more productive, more capable of adapting to stress. The simplified industrial landscapes Ruskin found hideous are also ecologically fragile, requiring constant inputs of fertilizers, pesticides, and energy to maintain. His aesthetic judgment tracked ecological health more accurately than the calculations of agricultural economists focused only on short-term yields. But Ruskin's environmental thought had significant limitations and blind spots. First, his focus was almost entirely on visible pollution and landscape degradation. He did not understand or anticipate less visible environmental problems like greenhouse gas accumulation, ocean acidification, or bioaccumulation of toxins. His warnings were prophetic but incomplete. Second, his environmental concern was entangled with class prejudice and aesthetic elitism. He cared deeply about preserving beautiful landscapes for spiritual and artistic contemplation, but showed less concern for the material environmental hazards facing poor workers. Lead poisoning, industrial accidents, toxic fumes in factories, these did not figure prominently in his environmental jeremiads. His was an aristocratic environmentalism concerned with preserving sublime nature, not a working-class environmentalism focused on occupational health and safety. Third, Ruskin had no theory of population or limits. His ecological insights existed in tension with his belief that society should support the maximum number of noble and happy human beings. He did not grapple with the question of how many humans the Earth can support at what standard of living, or whether there might be trade-offs between human abundance and ecological health. He assumed, somewhat magically, that virtuous production methods would automatically harmonize human needs with natural limits. Fourth, and most problematically, his environmental concern was purely national and often xenophobic. He worried about the degradation of England, but showed little concern for environmental destruction elsewhere, especially in the colonies supporting British prosperity. His environmental politics were compatible with imperialism. He wanted a green and pleasant England, supported by resource extraction from degraded peripheries. Contemporary environmental scholarship has had to reckon with this uncomfortable legacy. Ruskin clearly articulated key ecological insights that remain valid: the recognition of environmental limits, the understanding that economic growth can coincide with real impoverishment, the insistence that beauty and ecological health are linked. But these insights were expressed in frameworks that were elitist, nationalist, and inadequate to the global scope of environmental crisis. The historian Raymond Williams, in Culture and Society, argued that Ruskin and other Victorian critics of industrialism articulated genuine insights about the human and environmental costs of capitalism. But their solutions were romantic and reactionary, looking backward to pre-industrial social forms rather than forward to democratic control of industrial power. We can learn from their critiques without adopting their politics. Environmental justice scholars have noted that effective environmentalism must integrate concern for ecological health with concern for social justice and democratic participation. Ruskin's paternalistic top-down approach, where enlightened elites would guide society to more sustainable practices, has been tried repeatedly and failed. Effective environmental protection requires empowering the people most affected by environmental degradation, not asking them to trust their betters. Yet Ruskin's core insight that environmental degradation and social degradation are aspects of the same problem, that you cannot have a healthy society on a sick landscape or a sick society on a healthy landscape, remains powerful. The contemporary environmental movement at its best has learned this lesson, linking climate justice, worker rights, public health, and democratic participation in comprehensive visions of a sustainable society. The image of the storm cloud remains potent. Ruskin saw the darkness gathering, recognized it as the physical manifestation of moral and social illness, and warned of catastrophe if the course was not changed. We are living through the catastrophe he foresaw, though in forms he could not have imagined. Climate change, mass extinction, oceanic dead zones, these are the storm clouds of our century, and like Ruskin, we struggle to make others see the danger in time. His life's work was an extended argument that seeing beauty and ugliness for what they really are, has consequences for how we organize society. Nowhere is this more urgent than in environmental crisis, where our inability or refusal to see the damage we are causing may prove fatal. Ruskin's demand that we really look at what we are doing to the world remains the first step toward any solution. Part 5. The Experiment of St. George. In 1871, Ruskin attempted to translate his abstract social theories into concrete reality. He founded the Guild of St. George, a utopian community that would demonstrate how society could be organized according to his principles of just economy, noble labor, and reverence for beauty. The experiment was a comprehensive failure, collapsing within a few years and leaving Ruskin exhausted and bitter. But the reasons for its failure illuminate both the power and the fundamental inadequacies of his social vision. The Guild was based on explicitly pre-industrial and feudal principles. Ruskin envisioned a network of agricultural communities where workers would till the soil using traditional methods, produce their own food and clothing, and be educated in art, literature, and moral virtue by educated trustees. Members would swear oaths of obedience to the Guild's laws, which Ruskin himself would write. There would be no democracy. Members would not vote on decisions, but would be guided by those wiser than themselves. Ruskin donated substantial personal wealth to found the Guild, purchasing land and establishing museums where workers could view great art. He published detailed instructions for how Guild members should live, what they should eat, wear, and read. Everything was prescribed, from agricultural methods to moral conduct. It was social engineering on a grand scale, an attempt to create the ideal society through autocratic direction by an enlightened leader. The problems were immediately apparent. Very few people wanted to live according to Ruskin's strictures. The combination of hard agricultural labour, limited personal freedom, and paternalistic oversight appealed mainly to cranks and misfits, not the noble workers Ruskin imagined. Those who did join often had their own eccentric ideas and resented Ruskin's dictatorial control. The agricultural experiments failed economically, unable to compete with industrial farming. The museums attracted few visitors. Within a few years, the Guild existed mainly on paper, a network of scattered properties and a dwindling membership. Why did it fail so spectacularly? The immediate reasons are obvious. Ruskin was an impractical visionary with no management skills, trying to impose an archaic social model on people shaped by industrial modernity. But the deeper reasons reveal fundamental contradictions in his entire social philosophy. First, Ruskin's vision was profoundly undemocratic. He believed ordinary people needed to be guided by their betters, that they could not be trusted to make decisions about their own lives. This was not accidental paternalism, but core conviction. He opposed universal suffrage, trade unions, and worker self-organization, all of which he saw as mob rule. His ideal society was feudal, a hierarchy of station where everyone knew their place and accepted their role. This was not just morally repugnant by contemporary standards, it was practically unworkable. People who have experienced modern freedom, limited as it is, will not voluntarily return to serfdom even if you promise them beauty and moral education in exchange. Ruskin's Guild could only work with people who already shared his values and accepted his authority, which is to say, it could not work at scale or provide a model for society. Second, Ruskin fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between economic systems and individual virtue. He believed that if you could only educate people properly and expose them to beauty, they would naturally choose virtuous lives and just economic arrangements. But this puts the causal arrow backward. Economic systems shape what choices are possible and what values make sense. You cannot create islands of virtuous pre-industrial economy within a capitalist sea and expect them to flourish. The broader system will either crush them or force them to adapt. Marx, writing at the same time, understood this clearly. He argued that individual moral reform was pointless without systemic transformation, that you had to change the economic base before you could change values and consciousness. Ruskin, with his focus on individual virtue and education, was trying to change consciousness without touching the base, which meant he was perpetually surprised when material forces proved stronger than moral exhortation. Third, Ruskin's social vision was conservative in a very specific sense. It looked backward to idealized medieval community, rather than forward to new forms of social organization. This made it inherently nostalgic and unrealistic. The medieval past he idealized had never actually existed. It was a projection of his desires onto history. Real medieval society was brutal, hierarchical, and for most people, short and miserable. The beauty he celebrated was produced by a tiny elite on the backs of peasant labour he preferred not to think about. Yet, despite the failure of the Guild, Ruskin's broader social theory had significant influence, particularly on the British labour movement. His insistence that economic arrangements should serve human flourishing rather than abstract efficiency, his critique of laissez-faire economics, his recognition that poverty in the midst of plenty represented social failure. These ideas helped shape the intellectual foundations of British socialism. The first generation of Labour leaders, figures like Keir Hardie and Ramsay MacDonald, frequently cited Ruskin as an influence. They recognised that his paternalism and feudalism were unacceptable, but his moral critique of capitalism and his vision of an economy serving human needs rather than profit resonated deeply. They tried to preserve his insights while translating them into democratic forms, worker control rather than aristocratic guidance, universal welfare rather than charitable paternalism. Ruskin also influenced educational reform movements. His belief that education should cultivate the whole person, teaching appreciation of beauty and moral virtue alongside practical skills, found expression in progressive education movements from Montessori to Waldorf. His insistence that working people should have access to great art and literature helped justify public museums, libraries, and adult education programs. The Workers' Educational Association, founded in 1903, explicitly drew on Ruskin's vision of education as moral and aesthetic development, not just vocational training. In India, Ruskin's influence took unexpected forms. Mahatma Gandhi read Unto This Last in 1904 and called it one of the books that captured him and changed his life. Gandhi translated Ruskin's economic critique into an anti-colonial framework, arguing that British industrialism degraded both colonizer and colonized, and that Indian independence required rejection of industrial capitalism in favour of village-based craft production. Gandhi's vision of Swaraj, self-rule, combined political independence with economic self-sufficiency based on hand production, particularly spinning and weaving. This was Ruskin, filtered through very different cultural and political contexts, and it raised the same practical problems. Could a modern nation-state base its economy on craft production? Could village self-sufficiency provide adequate material welfare for hundreds of millions of people? Gandhi, like Ruskin, was stronger on moral vision than practical implementation. Independent India ultimately chose industrial development over craft production. though Gandhi's vision continues to influence debates about appropriate technology and sustainable development. Contemporary scholars have approached Ruskin's social theory from multiple angles. Some, particularly those in communitarian philosophy, have found value in his emphasis on local community, craft tradition, and moral economy as alternatives to abstract market relations. They argue that his critique of individualism and market logic remains relevant, even if his specific prescriptions do not. Others, particularly feminist and democratic theorists, have emphasized his authoritarianism and the need to completely rethink his insights in egalitarian terms. Ruskin's vision of social hierarchy was not peripheral but central to his thought, and any useful appropriation of his ideas requires fundamental reconstruction. The political philosopher Michael Walzer has argued that Ruskin identified real goods, meaningful work, aesthetic environment, moral community, but tried to secure them through illegitimate means, aristocratic rule rather than democratic deliberation. The question remains whether Ruskin's insights about work, beauty, and human flourishing can be separated from his reactionary politics, or whether they are inextricably linked. Some argue his romantic anti-capitalism was always implicitly authoritarian. That critique of industrial modernity without democratic politics necessarily devolves into aristocratic or fascist fantasies of organic hierarchy. Others believe his moral insights can be preserved while rejecting his political forms, that we can learn from his critique of capitalism without accepting his nostalgia for feudalism. The failure of the Guild of St. George teaches important lessons about the limits of voluntary experiment and individual virtue as strategies for social change. You cannot opt out of capitalism by forming alternative communities unless you are willing to accept permanent marginality and likely failure. Significant social transformation requires political power, democratic organization, and willingness to confront entrenched interests, precisely the things Ruskin rejected. Yet his attempt also suggests something important: the need for experimentation and imagination, for actually trying to build different ways of living rather than just theorizing about them. Most social movements have combined critique with practical experiments, cooperatives, communes, alternative institutions. These experiments usually fail in their immediate aims, but can generate knowledge and inspire broader movements. The Guild of St. George failed, but it helped imagine possibilities that influence more successful movements for social reform. Ruskin's final years were marked by increasing isolation and mental breakdown. The failure of his social experiments, the indifference of the public to his warnings, the continued triumph of everything he opposed, drove him into despair and madness. He spent his last decade mostly silent, unable to write or speak coherently. It is tempting to read this as the inevitable fate of prophets, destroyed by the refusal of their society to listen. But it also suggests the dangers of his entire approach. The attempt to reform society through individual moral witness rather than collective political action produced isolation rather than transformation. Part 6. The Prophet's Madness. In 1878, Ruskin suffered the first of what would become recurring episodes of severe mental illness, breakdowns that left him incapable of work for months at a time, and eventually forced his retirement from public life. The relationship between his madness and his philosophy remains one of the most contested aspects of his legacy. Was his increasing radicalism a symptom of mental instability, Or did his insights into social pathology drive him mad? Did his illness invalidate his ideas, or did it paradoxically enable him to see things sane people preferred to ignore? The biographical facts are clear enough, though their interpretation remains disputed. From his 50s onward, Ruskin experienced periodic psychotic episodes characterized by paranoid delusions, violent agitation, and complete breaks with reality. During these episodes, he believed himself persecuted by devils, spoke in incomprehensible streams of consciousness, and required physical restraint. Between episodes, he recovered lucidity but was increasingly fragile, his work marked by apocalyptic intensity and disconnected associations. Modern psychiatrists examining the historical record have offered various diagnoses: bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, late-onset psychosis, neurosyphilis, even frontotemporal dementia. The symptoms do not fit cleanly into any single diagnostic category, and we cannot know with certainty what Ruskin suffered from. What we can examine is how his mental state influenced his thought, and how his thought may have influenced his mental state. There is a troubling tendency, both among Ruskin's admirers and his critics, to use his madness as a way of dismissing or explaining away aspects of his work that make them uncomfortable. Conservative critics point to his mental illness as proof that his radical social critique was unbalanced ranting rather than serious analysis. Progressive admirers sometimes treat his madness as irrelevant to his ideas, as if mental illness and intellectual work occupied completely separate spheres. Both approaches are inadequate. The truth is more complex and more interesting. Ruskin's mental illness did affect his work, particularly in his later years, when his writing became increasingly fragmentary and apocalyptic. But the core insights that made him significant, the connections between aesthetics and ethics, work and human dignity, economic systems and environmental destruction, were articulated clearly during periods of mental stability. His madness may have intensified his perceptions and loosened his inhibitions against expressing unpopular truths, but it did not create his fundamental vision. Consider the question from another angle. What effect did the work of prophecy have on Ruskin's mental health? He devoted his life to speaking uncomfortable truths to a society that did not want to hear them, to warning of catastrophe while watching his warnings ignored, to seeing degradation and destruction that others explained away or simply did not see. This is not a psychologically sustainable position. The social theorist of mental illness Thomas Szasz argued that what gets labelled as madness is often rational response to intolerable social conditions. Someone who sees clearly the violence, hypocrisy and destruction embedded in normal social arrangements may appear insane precisely because their perception is accurate while conventional wisdom is deluded. This does not mean all mental illness is really social sanity, but it suggests that the line between insight and delusion is less clear than we might wish. Ruskin's apocalyptic intensity in his later work can be read as progressive loss of mental control or as appropriate response to genuine catastrophe that sane people preferred not to acknowledge. When he wrote about the storm cloud darkening England, about the filth and ugliness spreading everywhere, about the degradation of workers and destruction of beauty, he was describing real phenomena. That he expressed this in increasingly wild and religious language does not make the observations false. The question is whether the madness was in his perception or in a society that could look at industrial devastation and see only progress. This relates to a broader question about the relationship between artistic or prophetic vision and mental illness. Many great artists, writers and visionaries have struggled with severe mental illness. Is this coincidental, or is there something about the capacity for unusual perception that makes people vulnerable to psychological breakdown? Does the ability to see beyond conventional categories, to make connections others miss, come at the cost of stability? The psychologist K. Redfield Jamieson, in Touched with Fire, argued that there is a genuine association between creative achievement and mood disorders, particularly bipolar disorder. The hypomanic state, characterized by increased energy, decreased need for sleep, and rapid associative thinking, can enhance certain kinds of creative work, even as it poses risks for full-blown mania and depression. Ruskin's pattern of intense productive periods followed by collapse fits this pattern. But we should be cautious about romanticizing mental illness as the price of genius. Most people with mental illness are not geniuses, and many geniuses do not have mental illness. Moreover, treating madness as essential to creativity obscures the very real suffering it causes and can discourage people from seeking treatment. Ruskin's breakdowns were catastrophic for him and terrifying for those around him, not romantic episodes of inspired vision. A more useful question might be, how did Ruskin's particular mental structure, both its strengths and its vulnerabilities, shape his intellectual work? His capacity for sustained attention, his ability to perceive fine distinctions in visual experience, his moral intensity. These were clearly strengths that enabled his achievements. His rigidity, his inability to compromise or moderate his positions, his tendency toward apocalyptic thinking, these were vulnerabilities that limited his effectiveness and contributed to his isolation. The same qualities that made him a great critic made him a failed social reformer. Ruskin's personal life adds another dimension to understanding his psychological struggles. He had an unconsummated marriage that ended in annulment, a pattern of inappropriate attachments to very young girls, and profound difficulties with adult intimacy. Much ink has been spilled psychoanalyzing these issues, with interpretations ranging from repressed homosexuality to idealized platonic love to pedophilic obsession. The truth is probably that Ruskin was deeply psychologically damaged in ways that made ordinary adult relationships impossible, and this damage both fed into and was exacerbated by his social isolation and mental illness. Feminist scholars have been particularly critical of how Ruskin's personal psychosexual issues infected his broader social theory. His idealization of women as pure spiritual beings, too refined for industrial labour or democratic politics, was clearly projection of his own inability to relate to real women as full human beings. His prescription that women should remain in separate domestic sphere, teaching virtue and beauty, was rationalization of his own emotional inadequacies as universal social principle. This is not incidental, but reveals how his supposedly universal truths about society were often generalizations from his particular pathologies. The question of whether to engage with Ruskin's ideas, despite his psychological and personal problems, has no simple answer. On one hand, ideas should be judged on their merits regardless of their source, and many of Ruskin's insights remain valuable even if their origins were complicated. On the other hand, when someone's personal pathology deeply shapes their social prescriptions, especially around gender and sexuality, we need to approach their work critically rather than simply extracting what seems useful. Contemporary scholars attempting to rescue Ruskin for progressive purposes face a genuine difficulty. You cannot separate his aesthetic insights from his social theory, and you cannot separate his social theory from his authoritarian and patriarchal politics, and those politics were deeply connected to his psychological makeup. Any honest engagement has to acknowledge these connections rather than pretend they can be severed. Yet there remains something valuable in Ruskin's example. Not his specific ideas, but his insistence that how we see and what we make matters morally, that beauty and justice are connected, that we cannot wall off aesthetic or environmental concerns from economic and political life. These insights transcend his particular formulation and remain necessary even when everything else about his system is rejected. His madness, then, was neither proof of his genius nor invalidation of his ideas. It was human suffering that shaped and was shaped by his intellectual work, that intensified certain perceptions while distorting others, that enabled insights while preventing the practical wisdom needed to act on them effectively. Understanding this complexity makes Ruskin more interesting, not less, more human, and therefore more instructive about the possibilities and limits of individual vision as a tool for social change. Part 7. Ruskin's Children. The paradox of Ruskin's influence is that his most important effects came through disciples who rejected large parts of his philosophy. His direct attempts at social transformation failed, but his ideas, transformed and adapted by others, shaped movements and thinkers across the world. This suggests something important about how intellectual influence actually works. Ideas spread not through faithful transmission, but through creative misreading, through taking what proves useful and discarding what does not. We have already discussed Gandhi's encounter with Unto This Last in 1904. But the depth of Ruskin's influence on Gandhi deserves closer examination because it reveals both the power and the limits of translating ideas across radically different contexts. Gandhi read Ruskin during a train journey in South Africa and later wrote that the book transformed his life, that he discovered some of his deepest convictions reflected in Ruskin's work. He immediately translated it into Gujarati, his native language, giving it the title Sarvodaya, meaning the welfare of all. What Gandhi took from Ruskin was the moral critique of industrial capitalism, the insistence that economic arrangements should serve human flourishing rather than efficiency or profit. He embraced Ruskin's celebration of manual labour and craft production, his argument that the good life required productive work with one's hands. This fed directly into Gandhi's championing of khadi, hand-spun and hand-woven cloth, as both economic programme and political symbol. If Indians would spin their own cloth rather than buying British-manufactured textiles, they would simultaneously achieve economic independence and moral regeneration. But Gandhi transformed Ruskin's feudal paternalism into something very different, a democratic movement for self-determination. Where Ruskin wanted workers to trust aristocratic guidance, Gandhi organized mass civil disobedience and demanded political rights. Where Ruskin's ideal was a hierarchy of benevolent authority, Gandhi's was Swaraj, self-rule at every level, from individual to village to nation. He kept Ruskin's critique of industrial degradation, but rejected his authoritarian solution. This created its own contradictions. Gandhi's economic programme, like Ruskin's, was nostalgic and impractical at scale. Hand spinning could be a powerful symbol of resistance, but could not provide industrial employment for hundreds of millions. Independent India's leaders, including Nehru, admired Gandhi's moral vision but recognized that economic development required industrialization. The tension between Gandhian economics and developmental necessity remains unresolved in Indian politics, surfacing in debates about dams, mines, special economic zones, and the rights of traditional communities. Ruskin's influence in France took very different form through the novelist Marcel Proust. Proust translated Ruskin's books on art into French and wrote extensively about Ruskin's aesthetic philosophy. What attracted Proust was Ruskin's attention to visual detail, his method of looking slowly and completely, his recognition that aesthetic experience had moral and spiritual dimensions. Proust transformed this into his own art, the massive novel In Search of Lost Time, which treats memory and perception with the same patient attention Ruskin devoted to landscapes and architecture. But Proust also recognized a fundamental dishonesty in Ruskin that he called idolatry, the tendency to replace direct perception with aesthetic formulas, to see according to rules rather than looking freshly. Ruskin preached truth to nature, but sometimes lapsed into conventional moralizing, using aesthetic judgment to reinforce his prejudices rather than genuinely seeing. Proust's critique identified a real tension in Ruskin's work between his method of attention and his need to extract moral lessons, between genuine perception and ideological interpretation. In Russia, Leo Tolstoy found in Ruskin confirmation of his own developing critique of industrial capitalism and luxury. Tolstoy had independently arrived at many similar conclusions: that art should serve moral purposes, that wealth was often illusory, that manual labour was essential to the good life. Reading Ruskin strengthened Tolstoy's conviction and influenced his later social writings and his establishment of agricultural communes. Like Gandhi, Tolstoy took Ruskin's insights but adapted them to different religious and cultural frameworks, in his case a radical interpretation of Christian teaching. The influence on the British labour movement was more direct and pervasive. The first generation of socialist organisers and labour politicians consistently cited Ruskin as a formative influence, often more than Marx. Clement Attlee, who would become Prime Minister and architect of the post-war welfare state, wrote that Ruskin and William Morris had done more than anyone else to influence his political thinking. What these practical politicians took from Ruskin was not his specific social prescriptions, but his moral framework, the insistence that economic arrangements should be judged by whether they promoted human flourishing and dignity. This was Ruskin stripped of feudalism and paternalism, translated into democratic socialism. The welfare state, National Health Service, public housing, free education, these were attempts to realize in democratic and universal form Ruskin's principle that society should ensure all its members had access to the conditions for good lives. That the architects of these programs were elected representatives rather than aristocratic trustees was a crucial transformation Ruskin himself would likely have rejected, but it allowed his insights to find practical expression. In urban planning and architecture, Ruskin's influence flowed through multiple channels. Ebenezer Howard's Garden City movement explicitly drew on Ruskin's vision of integrating nature and human habitation, his recognition that cities needed beauty and green space, not just efficient production. The architect Frank Lloyd Wright read Ruskin intensively and absorbed his principles about organic form, about buildings that harmonized with rather than dominated their landscapes, about the importance of craft quality in construction. The entire arts and crafts architectural movement, from Charles Voysey to Edwin Lutyens in Britain to Green and Green in America, tried to realize Ruskin's principles of honest materials, visible craft, and regional appropriateness. But modernist architecture represents an interesting case of influence through rejection. The great modernists like Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius explicitly opposed Ruskin's celebration of ornament and handcraft, arguing for machine aesthetic and industrial production. Yet they shared his conviction that how buildings are made and what they look like matters morally, that architecture shapes human consciousness and behaviour. Le Corbusier's vision of bright, rational, machine-made buildings as tools for social transformation was anti-Ruskinian in form, but shared the underlying assumption that aesthetic and social questions were inseparable. The environmental movement has claimed Ruskin as a forerunner with some justice. His recognition that industrial capitalism was degrading the natural world, his insistence that beauty and ecological health were linked, his warnings about atmospheric pollution, all anticipate contemporary environmental thought. Organisations focused on landscape preservation, from the National Trust in Britain to the Sierra Club in America, have roots in movements Ruskin inspired or directly influenced. His belief that nature had intrinsic value beyond human use, that wild beauty should be protected even when it was economically irrational to do so, became foundational to conservation philosophy. But contemporary environmentalists have had to grapple with the limitations of Ruskin's framework. His focus on visible beauty meant he missed less aesthetically obvious but equally important environmental concerns. His elitism meant his environmental vision privileged aristocratic access to sublime nature over working-class concerns about industrial pollution and occupational health. His nationalism meant he could not conceive of environmental issues at global scale or address the ways British prosperity depended on environmental degradation elsewhere. The contemporary food and craft movements show Ruskin's influence in interesting ways. The celebration of artisan production, local food, and making as meaningful activity all echo Ruskinian themes. Farmers' markets, craft breweries, maker spaces, these can be seen as attempts to recover the connection between maker and product that Ruskin believed essential to good work and good lives. The critique of industrial food production as degrading both workers and eaters, the insistence that how food is grown and made matters beyond just price and convenience, these are recognizably Ruskinian arguments. But the same problems that plagued the arts and crafts movement persist. Craft production remains expensive, meaning it serves mainly affluent consumers who can afford to pay premium prices for artisan goods. The farmer's market is wonderful if you have money and leisure time, less helpful if you are working 2 jobs and shopping at the dollar store. Ruskin's insights about meaningful work and quality production have been largely captured by lifestyle marketing, selling the aesthetic of craft to wealthy consumers rather than transforming the conditions of actual workers. This raises a fundamental question about Ruskin's legacy. Have his ideas been successfully adapted and realized in democratic and egalitarian forms, or have they been defanged and commodified, turned into luxury consumption for elites while leaving underlying structures of exploitation unchanged? The answer is probably both. Real reforms in labour conditions, environmental protection and public access to beauty have occurred, partly due to movements Ruskin influenced. But capitalism has also proven remarkably adept at absorbing and marketing the aesthetic of craft and sustainability while maintaining exploitative production elsewhere, now often offshored where critics cannot see it. The question of influence is further complicated by the fact that many of Ruskin's insights were not unique to him, but were in the air, articulated by multiple thinkers responding to industrial capitalism from different angles. Distinguishing specifically Ruskinian influence from broader romantic anti-capitalism or early socialism is often impossible. He was both cause and symptom of his intellectual moment, and his ideas spread because they resonated with concerns many people already felt. What makes Ruskin specifically important, then, is not that he invented these critiques, but that he articulated them with particular power and connected them in distinctive ways. His insistence on linking aesthetics, ethics, economics and ecology created a synthetic vision that proved generative even for those who rejected large parts of it. Different movements and thinkers could extract different elements, finding in his work resources for their own projects. Gandhi took the economic critique and craft celebration, Proust the aesthetic method, socialists the moral framework, environmentalists the ecological awareness, and each found something genuinely valuable even as they discarded the rest. This suggests that Ruskin's most important legacy may be methodological rather than substantive. Not his specific answers, but his insistence that certain questions must be asked, that we cannot wall off aesthetic from ethical concerns, production from human flourishing, economic efficiency, from environmental health. That these domains are interconnected and must be thought together even when doing so is difficult and forces us to confront uncomfortable contradictions. This synthetic, holistic approach remains necessary even when particular synthesis Ruskin offered is rejected. Part 8. The Reckoning. To ask whether Ruskin was right requires first asking what it would mean for him to be right. His work was not primarily empirical hypothesis or practical program, but moral vision, claim about what matters and how we should live. Such claims cannot be proven true or false in straightforward ways. They can only be judged by whether they illuminate human experience, whether they help us see clearly and live well. By this standard, Ruskin was both profoundly right and catastrophically wrong, often about the same things. Start with what he got right, what remains valuable and necessary. His central insight, that perception, is a moral act, that how we see shapes what we can understand and do, has been powerfully confirmed by contemporary cognitive science and phenomenology. Attention is not neutral or automatic. It is shaped by our values, practices, and social contexts, and these in turn shape what possibilities we can perceive. A society that trains people to see only instrumentally, to view everything through the lens of profit or efficiency, will be unable to see forms of value and relationship that do not fit that framework. This is not just philosophical abstraction. It has measurable consequences for how we treat ecosystems, communities, and each other. His recognition that how we make things matters, that production methods have consequences for workers and society beyond just output, was prescient and remains urgent. The critique of industrial work as degrading human capacities anticipated by decades the formal academic study of alienation and job satisfaction. Contemporary research in occupational psychology largely confirms Ruskin's intuitions. Work that allows autonomy, variety, and meaningful connection to outcomes promotes well-being, while repetitive, controlled, meaningless work damages mental and physical health, even when it pays well. The epidemic of workplace dissatisfaction, burnout, and what anthropologist David Graeber called bullshit jobs, suggests Ruskin identified something real about human needs that purely economic analysis misses. His connection of aesthetic and ecological health, the recognition that ugliness often signals deeper dysfunction, has proven remarkably predictive. The landscapes Ruskin found hideous, industrial monocultures, polluted rivers, sprawling development, turn out to also be ecologically fragile and unsustainable. His aesthetic judgment tracked functional damage more accurately than the economic calculations that treated environmental destruction as acceptable externality. This does not mean beauty and ecological health are identical, but it suggests they are correlated in ways that purely instrumental thinking cannot see. His economic critique that conventional measures of wealth ignore real sources of human well-being and real forms of impoverishment has been vindicated by the entire field of welfare economics and quality of life research. We now know empirically what Ruskin argued morally, that gross domestic product growth is at best loosely connected to human flourishing, that it can coincide with increased misery, environmental destruction, and social breakdown. The development of alternative measures like the Human Development Index, Genuine Progress Indicator, and various happiness indices represents the mainstream catching up to Ruskin's insight that there is no wealth but life. So where was he wrong? Where do his insights fail or mislead? Most fundamentally in his solutions, in his vision of how to address the problems he identified. His feudal paternalism, his opposition to democracy, his belief that enlightened elites should guide grateful masses, this was not incidental error, but systematic blindness built into his entire worldview. Every attempt to implement Ruskinian principles in authoritarian or paternalistic forms has failed, usually by reproducing the very exploitation and degradation Ruskin opposed. The lesson here is crucial. You cannot achieve human flourishing through structures that deny human agency. Meaningful work, beautiful environment, just economy, these require democratic participation, not aristocratic direction. Ruskin's insights about what matters must be combined with democratic methods he rejected, and doing so requires rethinking them fundamentally rather than just adding democracy as external improvement. His romantic anti-modernism, his nostalgia for medieval organic community was not just historically inaccurate but conceptually confused. The past he idealized had never existed, and the attempt to recreate it was doomed because you cannot unknow modernity, cannot uninvent democracy and individual rights and scientific method. The question is not how to return to pre-modern conditions, but how to preserve what was valuable, meaningful work, community, connection to nature, within or alongside modern capabilities. Ruskin's backward-looking vision could not address this, and attempts to follow it led to reactionary dead ends. His gender politics were not just products of Victorian convention, but deeply integrated with his philosophical system. His idealization of women as spiritual beings, too pure for economic or political life, his confinement of them to domestic sphere as teachers of virtue, this was not peripheral but central to his social vision. Feminist scholars have shown how this both reflected and reinforced structures of patriarchal control. how it denied women full humanity while claiming to honour their special nature. Moreover, his definition of meaningful work excluded the care work, textile production, and domestic labour performed primarily by women, treating it as natural activity rather than skilled work deserving recognition and fair compensation. This is not just historical interest, but live issue. Contemporary debates about care work, emotional labour, and the value of reproductive labour are still wrestling with assumptions Ruskin helped entrench, that some forms of work are naturally feminine and therefore should not be compensated or recognised in the same way as masculine production. Recovering his insights about work requires fundamentally rethinking his gendered categories, recognising that care is work and must be valued as such. His Eurocentrism and implicit imperialism represent another set of deep problems. Ruskin's aesthetic theory, despite claims to universal truth, was provincial, treating European artistic conventions as timeless standards and dismissing or ignoring non-European traditions. His economic analysis focused entirely on England while ignoring how British prosperity depended on colonial extraction, slavery, and environmental degradation in peripheries. He could condemn industrial degradation of English landscapes while remaining blind to the degradation British Empire imposed elsewhere. Post-colonial scholars have shown how this was not accidental, but structural. Ruskin's vision of beautiful verdant England served by manual craft labour required importing raw materials and exporting ecological costs to colonies. His green and pleasant land depended on making other lands less green and pleasant, a dependence his theory could not acknowledge because it would undermine the entire moral framework. Any contemporary appropriation of Ruskin must confront this, recognising that environmental and social justice must be global, or they are not justice at all. His failure to understand capitalism as system rather than just collection of moral failures is another major limitation. Ruskin thought the problems of industrial society resulted from wrong values and choices, that if only people could be properly educated and exposed to beauty, they would naturally choose better arrangements. This missed how structural forces constrain choices, how competition drives exploitation even when individual actors might prefer otherwise, how system logic produces outcomes no one individually chooses. You cannot reform capitalism through moral witness and aesthetic education, though these may be necessary parts of broader transformation requiring political power and institutional change. His economic theory, while containing important insights, lacked any workable mechanism for actually organizing production and distribution at scale. Just price and just wage are meaningless without institutional methods for determining them and enforcing them. Market coordination, whatever its flaws, at least provides decentralized mechanism for matching supply and demand. Ruskin offered no alternative except vague appeals to virtue and wisdom of leaders, which is not economics but fantasy. Yet even these failures prove instructive. They show us what questions we must answer if we want to preserve Ruskin's insights in workable form. How do we achieve democratic participation while preserving space for expertise and long-term thinking? How do we value care and maintenance alongside production and innovation? How do we create meaningful work at scale with modern technology? How do we ensure environmental protection is global and not just displaced to poorer regions? These are precisely the questions contemporary movements for social and ecological transformation must address, and Ruskin's failures show us what does not work. The question of contemporary relevance becomes pressing when we recognize the scale of crises we face. Climate change, mass extinction, resource depletion, these are the storm clouds of the 21st century. And they are, as Ruskin would have understood them, symptoms of fundamental disorder in how we relate to world and each other. The accelerating environmental catastrophe makes his warning about filth and degradation seem prophetic. We are living through the disaster he foresaw, though in forms and at scales he could not have imagined. The question is whether Ruskinian insights about attention, work and value can help us address these crises, or whether they are hopelessly entangled with reactionary politics that make them useless or dangerous. The answer is probably that we need something like his synthetic vision, his refusal to separate aesthetic, ethical, economic and ecological concerns, but developed in radically different political and intellectual frameworks. We need his questions without his answers, his method of holistic attention without his nostalgic prescriptions. Contemporary movements attempting this synthesis exist but remain marginal. Degrowth economics tries to separate human flourishing from material accumulation, asking how we can live well with less environmental impact. This is recognizably Ruskinian in spirit, the insistence that real wealth is life, not stuff, but it is developed with attention to democracy, global justice and practical implementation that Ruskin lacked. The environmental justice movement connects ecological protection with social justice and democratic participation, refusing to separate them as Ruskin often did. The maker and repair movements, open source production, tool libraries, these represent attempts to recover meaningful work and resist disposable consumer culture. They echo Ruskin's celebration of craft, but in democratic and participatory forms rather than aristocratic patronage. Whether they can scale or remain boutique practices for the privileged remains open question. The ultimate test of Ruskin's relevance is whether his core insights, that perception matters morally, that beauty and justice are connected, that economic arrangements should serve human flourishing, can be separated from his authoritarian and reactionary politics and developed in democratic and egalitarian forms. I believe they can, but doing so requires not just extracting useful bits, but fundamentally reconstructing the framework. We need to ask Ruskinian questions. What kind of work makes human life meaningful? How do we create beautiful environments for everyone, not just elites? How do we measure real rather than illusory wealth, but answer them through democratic deliberation and universal participation rather than aristocratic prescription? This means Ruskin is neither hero to be celebrated nor villain to be condemned, but complex, contradictory thinker who saw certain truths clearly while being blind to others, whose insights remain valuable precisely because they are entangled with dangerous politics that must be confronted rather than ignored. The work of inheriting his legacy is critical work, taking what proves useful while rejecting what does not, transforming insights from one context for very different circumstances. The question he posed most powerfully was whether a society that produces ugly things through degraded labour while destroying the natural world can be called prosperous, no matter how much wealth it accumulates. We have not answered that question. We have spent the century and a half since Ruskin asked it, accumulating more wealth and more degradation simultaneously. The crises now upon us make the question unavoidable. Whether we have the courage to follow Ruskin in asking it and the wisdom to avoid his errors in answering it may determine what human future is possible. John Ruskin was a man who could look at a cloud and see civilization's sickness, who could examine a carved stone and read in its imperfection the freedom of the hand that made it, who understood that beauty and justice were not separate concerns, but aspects of the same question about how to live. He was also an authoritarian reactionary who wanted workers to know their place, who denied women full humanity, who could see degradation in English factories while remaining blind to imperial exploitation, whose solutions to the problems he identified were often worse than the problems themselves. Both these descriptions are true, and neither cancels the other. This is what makes Ruskin important and difficult, necessary and dangerous, someone we must grapple with rather than simply accept or reject. His central legacy is methodological, the insistence that we cannot understand human life by dividing it into separate domains that do not communicate. Economics, aesthetics, ethics, ecology, these are not independent spheres, but aspects of single reality, and thinking them together, even when difficult, is necessary for understanding what is actually happening and what we should do. Contemporary intellectual life, despite some progress, remains largely divided into specializations that cannot see beyond their boundaries. We have economists who treat environmental destruction as externality, ecologists who ignore social justice, political theorists who dismiss aesthetics as elitist concern, artists who pretend their work has no political content. Ruskin's holistic vision, his refusal of these divisions, remains necessary corrective. Not his specific synthesis, which was deeply flawed, but the demand that we think synthetically, that we refuse to accept that efficiency and beauty, productivity and well-being, growth and health are separate concerns requiring separate specialists. His teaching about attention, that how we see matters, and that truly seeing requires moral and intellectual discipline, has perhaps never been more relevant. We live in an age of systematic distraction, of technologies designed to fragment attention and make sustained looking impossible. The capacity to look slowly and completely at anything, whether cloud or painting or social arrangement, is increasingly rare and increasingly necessary. Ruskin's practice of devoted attention, of spending hours or days observing single object until its truth revealed itself, models a way of being in the world that resists the accelerating superficiality of contemporary life. His insistence that work matters, that how we spend our productive hours shapes who we become, cuts against the grain of both capitalist instrumentalism and post-work utopianism. The question of whether humans need meaningful productive activity or could be equally fulfilled in pure leisure remains unresolved, and Ruskin's arguments that work is essential to human dignity and development deserve serious engagement. This is not the same as arguing for wage slavery, or that people should have to work to deserve existence. It is recognizing that the capacity to make things, to transform material reality through skilled effort, may be essential to flourishing in ways we give up at our peril. His economic critique that conventional measures of wealth are systematically delusional, that they confuse means with ends and count destruction as growth, has been partially absorbed into mainstream thinking, but not nearly enough. We still organize society around maximizing gross domestic product, while knowing this correlates poorly with actual human well-being, and often requires environmental destruction that undermines long-term prosperity. Ruskin's demand that we measure real wealth, life and its possibilities, rather than abstract exchange values, remains radical and unimplemented. Most importantly, perhaps, Ruskin understood that the crises we face, environmental, social, spiritual, are not separate problems requiring separate solutions, but symptoms of disordered relationship between humans and world, between humans and each other, between production and human need. Climate change is not a technical problem requiring only technological fix. It is manifestation of ways of seeing and valuing that treat world as resource to be exploited, rather than reality to be honoured. Social inequality is not just an economic problem, but reflects and reinforces ways of seeing that deny full humanity to some while elevating others. The ugliness of contemporary built environment is not an aesthetic problem, separate from questions of justice and ecology, but expression of same instrumentalizing logic that degrades workers and destroys ecosystems. If Ruskin is right about this, then addressing these crises requires not just policy changes or technological innovations, but transformation in how we see, value, and act. This is harder than technical fix. It requires changing ourselves and our institutions, but it may be necessary. And it means that artists, moralists and visionaries have roles to play alongside scientists and policymakers, that seeing clearly and beautifully is not luxury, but necessity. But we must do this work, if we do it, without Ruskin's authoritarianism, his nostalgia, his exclusions. The transformation we need must be democratic, must empower rather than guide from above, must include rather than exclude, must look forward to new possibilities rather than backward to imagined golden ages. We need Ruskin's questions without his answers, his insights stripped of his prejudices, his method applied to problems he never imagined in contexts he could not conceive. This is the work of every generation, inheriting from the past what remains valuable while rejecting what does not, transforming insights from one context for use in another. Ruskin gave us powerful tools for seeing clearly, for refusing false separations, for recognizing connections between beauty and justice, work and human dignity, economy and ecology. He also left us a warning about the dangers of authoritarian solutions, nostalgic politics and moral vision untethered from democratic practice. Both the tools and the warning remain necessary. In the end, Ruskin's most important legacy may be the example of someone who insisted that how we make things and what we make of the world matters absolutely, who refused to accept that these questions were too philosophical or aesthetic to be practical, who spent his life trying to make people see what they preferred not to see. He largely failed in his own terms. His society did not listen and continued on the course he warned against. But his questions survived him and remain unanswered, more urgent now than when he first posed them. That is perhaps the best a prophet can hope for, not to be proven right in their lifetime, but to ask questions that outlive them, to name problems that cannot be ignored, however much we might wish to. There is no wealth but life. If we could truly see what that means, truly act on it, we would live in a different world. Ruskin could see it, even if he could not build it. The question is whether we can do better, whether we can preserve his insight while avoiding his errors, whether we can create forms of common life that honour beauty, dignity and the natural world, while also honouring democracy, equality and human freedom. That work remains unfinished, more urgent with each passing year. And Ruskin, for all his flaws, remains a necessary companion in attempting it.